Well, good morning, everyone. Last week I spoke on Ecclesiastes, and what I'm hoping to do today is to finish with part 2. So just going to give a very brief recap for any who weren't here last week. What I said, I started Ecclesiastes where, let's just turn to it. Yeah. Where it starts off by saying, "Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity." And we looked at the word vanity and saw that it meant futile, meaningless, emptiness. And we looked at the first 2 chapters of Ecclesiastes. And what we did was to look for the positives in what is a relatively empty book. And I concluded by opening up a parcel which I'd brought. And the parcel, when I opened it up, was empty. And I then made the connection between the empty parcel and the empty tomb. And the point with Ecclesiastes is so much of what is written in Ecclesiastes reflects life without a meaningful God in the situation. And it was only as Jesus rose from the dead that brought meaning and understanding into life itself. There's a book which I've been reading, I've referred to in the past before, a book by a guy called Gifford. And he talks in that book about image, and he says we're made in the image and likeness of God. But he relates the image to a shadow. And you know, where a shadow goes, where you go, the shadow goes. And we need to be like that. We need to move with God and work with God. And our true purpose in life can only be found in and through him. So what we're going to do today is look at the rest of Ecclesiastes. And I'm not going to look at it in detail. I'm going to pull out a few relevant verses, make 1 or 2 comments on them, and then move on. So I'm going to start with chapter 3, but I'm going to leave out the first 8 verses, which many of you will know very well, because it talks about time and seasons. Now I'm going to come to that at the end. So I'm going to start with Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 11, which says, "He has made everything beautiful in its time, but not everybody sees the beauty." When I was a teacher, teaching in primary schools, occasionally I used to do assemblies with the children. And I remember reading a story once, and I looked for the story and I couldn't find it in our books that we've got at home, so I don't know where it's gone. But it was about a slave girl who worked in the States, on an estate. And one day the owner of the estate drew everyone's attention to the beautiful sunset. And this slave girl made a comment about it. And he said, "Well, why are you so surprised?" And she said, "Well, sir, before you came here, I never ever saw the sunsets." And he had drawn her attention to the beauty of the sunsets, but she didn't see it before. And you see, God has made everything beautiful in its time. And it goes on to say, also he has put eternity in their hearts. It's an interesting one, isn't it? Wherever you go in the world, you find that people have eternity in their hearts because they're searching for God. God, who is the Alpha and Omega, who is and who was and who is to come, the Almighty. And then in Hebrews 13:8, you've got Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. God has put eternity into our hearts. Romans 1, verses 19 and 20 says this: "Because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse." In other words, everybody can see creation and what God has done, but not everybody appreciates it. Not everybody can grasp it. Let's move on. Verses 12 to 13. "I know that nothing is better for them than to rejoice and to do good in their lives, and also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labour. It is the gift of God." Rejoice and do good. Galatians 6 verse 10 says, "Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially to those who are of the household of faith." And then in verse 14, it says, "I know that whatever God does, it shall be forever." Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. God does it that men should fear before him. And that's the phrase I wanted to get. God does it that men should fear before him. And I just want to make the one comment that today men, particularly in our Western civilization, have lost their fear and their awe of God. 3:15, "And God requires an account of what is past." Well, we know about the final judgment, but we also know about the parable of the talents. You know, the parable of the talents are just says, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a man travelling to a far country, who called to his own servants and delivered them goods. And to one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, to each according to his own ability. And immediately he went on a journey. And he who had received the 5 talents went and made another 5. I'm just paraphrasing now. And similarly, the one who had 2 gained 2 more. But the person who'd only had 1 talent went and dug it in the ground and just kept it and didn't do anything with it. And when the king came back, he was not best pleased to find that the guy who'd only had 1 talent hadn't done much with it. The question is, do we recognise what our talents are? Do we recognise what our giftings are? Often, you know, someone else can spot what your gifting is without you being aware of it. So it's important that we recognise what our giftings are, so that we can make the most of the talents which God has given us. 3:16. "In the place of judgment, wickedness was there." And when I read that, I was reminded of Isaiah chapter 5. And Isaiah chapter 5 says in verses 20 and 23, and I've read this before, at this platform, woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter, who acquit the guilty for a bribe, but deny justice to the innocent. And I just thought that those verses in Ecclesiastes, in the place of judgment, wickedness was there, and that's really superbly expressed in Isaiah. Move on now to chapter 4, verses 9 to 12. I'll just read them and then I'll make a couple of comments. Some of you will know these very well. 2 are better than 1 because they have a good reward for their labour. For if they fall, 1 will lift up his companion. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up. Again, if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can 1 be warm alone? Though 1 may be overpowered by another, 2 can withstand him, and a 3-fold cord is not quickly broken. No one to help him up. My comment on that is that in this church we have connect groups. They're meant to be there to support each other. The purpose of our connect groups is so that we can support each other and build each other up and encourage one another. So it's important that all of us give serious consideration to whether we should be in a connect group or not. Because it may be that if you're not in a connect group, you're actually missing out, because the only time you're actually meeting with Christian folks may be only on a Sunday, and maybe that's not enough. And then verse 12, a three-corded strand, which I've often heard described as within a marriage setting, where you have 2 people who are married, and then you bring Jesus into the situation, and you've got a three-corded strand. And you know, as I was looking at this, the Lord gave me another perspective on it. There's God the Father, there's God the Son, and there's God the Holy Spirit, and that's a three-corded strand. Isn't that wonderful? Chapter 5, verse 1. Walk prudently when you go to the house of God. Walk prudently when you go to the house of God. What this speaks to me of is preparation. Walking circumspectly and in holiness throughout the week, so that when we come to Mount Olive, when we come here to worship, we come prepared to worship and prepared to hear God's word. We shouldn't really be coming here to get our top up with God on a Sunday in the hope that it will see us through the rest of the week. Our top up with God should be on a daily basis, so that when we arrive here on a Sunday, suddenly we explode. Because we all bring our experience of God in the week, and we then explode in worship and praise. Walk prudently when you go to the house of God. Chapter 5, verse 5, better not to vow than to vow and not pay. That's an interesting verse, but it reminded me of the parable of Jesus in Matthew 21. And verses 28 to 32, which I'll read to you. But what do you think? A man had 2 sons, and he came to the first and said, Son, go work today in my vineyard. He answered and said, I will not, But afterwards he regretted it and went. Then he came to the second and said likewise, and he answered and said, I go, sir. But he did not go. Which of the two did the will of his father? They said to him, the first. Jesus said to him, assuredly I say to you that tax collectors and harlots enter the kingdom of God before you. The point I want to make there is that it's better not to promise something and then to go and do it than to promise to do something and then not do it. Chapter 5, verse 7 says, but fear God. Wise advice. At the end of Ecclesiastes, the writer gets to that fear God again. He returns to it when he sums up all of his ramblings. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. And I just love the way the Message translates that. It says, the last and final word is this: fear God, do what he tells you. 5 verse 9. Moreover, the profit of the land is for all. Even the king is served from the field. And what struck me in that verse was a question of, it's all about sharing. But, you know, when we look at our world situation, what we see is major inequalities, where the rich nations prosper and the poor nations struggle even to feed their own people. 5 verse 10. He who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver, nor he who loves abundance with increase. You know, the thing is, some people are never satisfied. When they've made their first million, they want to make the next million. It doesn't matter how much they've got, they just want more. You see, the key to life is not how much you've got, it's about contentment. And we'll come to that a bit later on. Moving on now to chapter 7. 7 verse 10 says, do not say, why were the former days better than these? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this. And what that reminds me of is, you know, those people who say, oh, I remember the good old days. You know, we remember how good the weather was, you know, as a child. It was always sunny. Everything seems rosy when you look back, doesn't it, sometimes? But it says, you do not inquire wisely. There's a writer called Ronald Dunn. I've got a couple of his books on my bookshelves at home. And he had a very difficult, sad personal situation. And he wrote about it. But you see, when something really bad happens, we often ask the question, why? Why did God allow this? Why did God allow that? And he says in his book, by asking the question why, we're asking the wrong question. He says what we really need to be asking is, what next? What do we do next? Not why did it happen, but now it's happened, how do we approach the situation? How do we proceed on from this point? Which is, I think, the way forward. 7:13. Consider the work of God, for who can make straight what he has made crooked? I've interpreted that as, in other words, don't fight against God, but submit to his leading. For who can make straight what he has made crooked? We can't change what God has done. If something happens in our lives, we have to accept where we're at and then move forward. Don't fight against God. And then a bit later on in 7:17, this is a really interesting one. I don't know what you're going to make of this one, and my comments on it could be interesting. It says in chapter 7, verse 17, "Why should you die before your time? Why should you die before your time?" How can we affect the length of our lives? Some might say, well, it's all in the Lord's hands, when my time's up, that's it. But it depends how you live as to what happens to you. Let me give you some examples. If someone has an argumentative spirit and they're always going around criticising people, looking for trouble, that puts the body under stress. That's not good for your body. It's going to hit you and it's going to come back at you at some point in time. If you know that smoking is not good for your health, don't smoke. If you know that taking drugs isn't good for your health, don't take drugs. If you've got an alcohol problem, don't drink alcohol. Now, I'm not trying to say that it's easy. I mean, in just saying that, I know that for people who've got those sort of problems, it's not easy to give up those things. I've got another one here as well. If you know that overeating is not good for your health, don't overeat. You've only got to walk down the high street to see how in our Western civilization, a large portion of the population are overweight. So the key is, whatever the problem is, to get help, and that may mean you need deliverance. I heard of someone was telling me just a few days ago about somebody who had an alcohol problem. And this person talked about having a spirit of alcohol. And they cast the spirit out, and the person didn't have an alcohol problem anymore. It went just like that. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen to everybody, but, we need to seek help and be aware that we've got to find ways out of problems like this. And it's ain't easy. But that's, again, coming back to what I was saying. It's where connect groups and meeting together with other like-minded can help us through these difficult times. And I've got a little note here, because obviously the examples I've given are about physical issues, but the same applies to spiritual issues. If we know something's bad for us spiritually, don't do it. Verse 29 says, "This only have I found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes." And that reminded me of Genesis and the fall. See, God made man upright. He made him ready, gave him a perfect garden, but he fell, and that's led to problems. Moving on, I've got a verse for our pastor here. Chapter 10, verse 9. "He who quarries stones may be hurt by them, and he who splits wood may be endangered by it. If the axe is dull and one does not sharpen the edge, then he must use more strength, but wisdom brings success." I'm sure Paul's materials that he uses to split his wood with are very sharp. Chapter 11, verse 1. "Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days." Which I'm going to read in the Message, because I think the message conveys it perfectly. Be generous. Invest in acts of charity. Charity yields high returns. And verse 5. As you do not know what is the way of the wind, or how the bones grow in the womb of her who is with child, so you do not know the works of God who makes everything. Which again in the message reads, just as you'll never understand the mystery of life forming in a pregnant woman, so you'll never understand the mystery at work in all that God does. And the trouble with us is we try to understand all that God's doing, but we can't always understand what God is doing. (12) 1 to 5, which to save time I'll go straight to the message and read to you. Honour, this is particularly for the younger members of our congregation. Honour and enjoy your Creator while you're still young, before the years take their toll and your vigour wanes, before your vision dims and the world blurs. In other words, you need specs to be able to see. And the winter years keep you close to the fire. In old age, your body no longer serves you so well. Muscles slacken, grip weakens, joints stiffen. The shades are pulled down on the world. You can't come and go at will. Things grind to a halt. The hum of the household fades away. You are wakened now by birdsong. Hikes to the mountains are a thing of the past. Even a stroll down the road has its terrors. Your hair turns apple blossom white, adorning a fragile and impotent matchstick body. Just thought I'd cheer you up. The trouble is, you see, when you're young, you assume that you're always going to be like that, and you value your physicality and all that sort of thing. But the reality is that as you get older, things change. I mean, if I look around this congregation, there are some wearing glasses. There's a percentage in here who would not be prepared to admit to it, but they've got dentures. And there are a number who may be struggling because they haven't got hearing aids, but the rest of you who have got hearing aids can actually hear what I'm saying. And that's only to deal with some of the issues. But Isaiah, chapter 40, verses 30 and 31 say this: even youths grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall, but those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. So even though those of us who are older than some may be losing a little bit of our vision and a little bit of our hearing and so on, with the Lord there, we can rise like eagles. We can rise above our circumstances and our situation. And then, in order to save time, I'll just read the final verse 14. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. For fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. Which the message says, the last and final word is this: fear God, do what he tells you. And that's it. That's how God will bring everything that we do out into the open and judge it according to its hidden intent, whether it's good or evil. And that's where he finishes. But of course, I haven't quite finished yet, because I haven't dealt with verses 1 to 8 of chapter 3. So let's just go back to chapter 3, 1 to 8, And I'm going to go over time slightly, but just bear with me. I'm going to read it. To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to gain and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. And there are other verses that I haven't read. Chapter 3, verse 17, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there for every purpose and every work. And 7:14, in the day of prosperity be joyful, but in the day of adversity consider, surely God has appointed the one as well as the other, so that man can find out nothing that will come after him. And this reflects Hebrew thought, which saw both coming from God. And I have one or two examples, which I haven't got time to share with you today. And then chapter 9, verse 11, but time and chance happen to them all. You see, sometimes good things happen to us, and sometimes bad things happen to us. Sometimes it's our own fault when bad things happen, and sometimes it's just the way things are. Sometimes it's our own foolishness. Sometimes it's our own folly and mistakes, which mean that we go one way rather than another. But the key for us as Christians is how we respond to circumstances. I gather at the most recent ladies' breakfast, there was somebody there who gave a testimony of how God had moved in her life in quite remarkable ways. Well, the thing is that she had worked and overcome the circumstances through the Word of God. And that is the key. It was her reaction which has seen her through, not being downbeaten by the circumstances that she's faced, but coming through in victory. And St. Paul talks about contentment in his epistles. I wonder how Paul might have rewritten the verses that I've just read to you, a time for this and a time for that. We all know what Paul writes in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23 and 28. He lists all the bad things that have happened to him. And so I've rewritten a time for this and a time for that in the light of what Paul wrote there. A time to be beaten and a time to recover. A time to be exposed to death and a time to live again. A time to be in prison and a time to be free. A time to be shipwrecked and a time to get safely to land. A time to be in danger and a time to be free of danger. A time to be weary and a time to recover one's strength. A time to starve and fast and a time to eat. God uses all of our life experiences in his economy. As I said earlier, the key is contentment. Paul writes in Philippians, I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And he writes to Timothy saying, now godliness with contentment is great gain. And I'll just add this: the dangers of a prosperity gospel, which focuses on prosperity to the exclusion of adversity. We all meet both in life, but there's a danger that as we go through life, it's not going to be all roses. It's going to be difficult at times. But it's how we respond to those circumstances which is the key. To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven. I haven't got time to go through and talk about other examples of seasons in the New Testament, but Titus 1:3 is one, how God has in due time manifested his word. When the time was right, God revealed things. And Timothy 4:2, preach the word, be ready in season and out of season. I wrote my own a time to bring it up to date. A time to buy and a time to sell. Retail therapy, people go and buy things just because it's going to make them feel better. But they need to turn to God rather than to material things. A time to pray and a time to refrain from praying. If you pray for something and you feel you've broken through, you don't need to keep on asking God for it. You can thank God for it. A time to ask and a time to give thanks. A time to give and a time to receive. People find it very difficult to receive. A time to work and a time to relax. You'll like this one. A time to look at your mobile and a time to switch it off. A time to listen to social media and a time to ignore it. A time to walk and a time to ride. When I was a child, we used to walk to school. You stand outside of any school building today, and I guarantee you'll see very few children and parents walking to school. And one for me last Friday, a time to win and a time to lose. I lost rather abysmally. But I can't complain. I lost to a born-again Christian who goes to a church in Exeter. And interestingly, what a God appointment. There were 32 of us in a drawn competition and we two got drawn together. Interesting, isn't it? So, I haven't had time really to go into seasons, but I've dealt with seasons, and I think and hope that you've got the idea that, we all go through different seasons in life. And so, just to finish, I can ask the question, which season do you think you're in at this present time in life? And to ask the question which somebody said to me recently, which season is Mount Olive in? And on that note, I'll finish. Thank you.